when Sera was dragged to the courtyard, publicly humiliated under full moon for being wolfless, useless, chained and locked up in a room. That was to be the beginning of her suffering. The next day, she was nowhere to be found again. Only the chains left in the room. She disappeared. But she returned to become who the kingdom never thought of. Find out what happened in this werewolf romance story. The night they dragged Sera into the courtyard, the moon was already high above them, full and bright, casting a cold silver light over everything, as if it had come to witness what was about to happen. The crowd was louder, crueler, closer. They surrounded her in a loose circle, not as one of their own, but as something beneath them, something unworthy of standing among wolves, and the laughter that followed her every step made that clear. She is wolfless. She is useless. Why is she even still here? Sera stumbled as she was shoved forward, her body hitting the ground harder than expected as her knees struck the cold stone, sending a sharp wave of pain up her legs. But she didn't react the way they wanted her to. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She had learned that lesson a long time ago. Begging only made them stay longer. A hand grabbed her hair, forcing her head up so she had no choice but to look at them. "Look," someone said, laughing. "Let her see what she'll never be." The crowd responded instantly. Louder. Harsher. Sera's chest tightened, but her face stayed still, her expression empty in the way only someone used to pain could manage, because breaking here would only give them exactly what they came for. Then, "Stand her up." The voice cut through everything. Not loud, but absolute. The laughter died almost immediately, and the hands that held her loosened just enough for her to be pulled back to her feet. Sera didn't need to be told who had spoken. The voice was weighty enough for her to know who the person was. Alpha King Carl. She had never been this close to him before, and people like her weren't meant to be. But as she was forced upright, her eyes lifted slightly, just enough to meet his. He stood a few steps away, completely still, his presence alone enough to silence an entire courtyard without effort. And when his gaze moved over her, it wasn't cruel or angry. It was worse. It was indifferent. "This is her?" he asked. "Yes, my king," one of the guards replied quickly. "The wolfless—" Carl raised a hand slightly. The guard stopped. Carl stepped forward. Slow, measured, each step closing the distance in a way that made it harder to breathe. And when he stopped in front of her, close enough for her to feel it, Sera forced herself not to look away. "You don't kneel properly," he said. Her throat tightened, but she answered anyway. "I was pushed." A murmur followed. Carl's eyes lingered on her a moment longer than before, then shifted slightly. Push her again. This time the shove was harder, and Sera went down without catching herself, her knees striking the stone again, sharper, deeper. But even then, she didn't lower her head. The laughter returned. But Carl didn't join them. He was watching her. Carefully. Waiting. Sera pressed her hand lightly against the ground, steadying herself as she straightened again, refusing to bow, refusing to speak, refusing to give them anything more than silence. "You're weak," Carl said. The words were simple, final. Unfit for any pack. They should have hurt. They didn't. Because she had heard worse. But then he added, "And yet—" The courtyard quieted again, the shift immediate, as if even the air needed to hear what came next. Carl tilted his head slightly, studying her now with something closer to interest. "You didn't beg." Sera swallowed. "I have nothing to beg for." That changed something. Small, but real. Carl looked at her differently now, not dismissing her, not ignoring her, but seeing her, and that made everything more dangerous. "Good," he said. Then, "Mark her?" The reaction was instant. Shock rippled through the crowd, louder than before, but Sera didn't hear most of it because her focus snapped back to him. "No!" The word slipped out before she could stop it. Carl's gaze dropped to her again. "Hold her now. You don't refuse me." "I don't belong to you," she said, her voice shaking but still holding. That silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Carl stepped forward without another word, his hand catching her chin, forcing her still as he lowered his head. "You do now." Then, pain, sharp, immediate. His teeth broke her skin, and the moment the bond formed, Sera felt it. Except it wasn't what it was supposed to be. It didn't settle. It didn't warm. It burned. Her body locked as something surged through her, deeper than the bond itself, something that didn't feel new but awakened, and Carl froze for the briefest second because what he felt in return was wrong. Not calm, not controlled, unstable, alive. Sera's breath broke as the energy spiked through her veins, her fingers tightening involuntarily, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes glowed silver, faint, but unmistakable. Then, darkness. Her body gave out. The crowd erupted again, but Carl didn't move. His gaze fixed on her as something in him registered what had just happened, something he couldn't explain. Because weak things didn't react like that. And wolfless girls didn't feel like that. "Take her," he said finally. His voice was steady again, controlled, but his eyes didn't leave her. Sera woke to darkness, the kind that felt heavy rather than quiet, and the first thing she noticed was the burn at her neck. The second, the chains. Cold metal wrapped tight around her wrists, biting into her skin as she tried to move, her body still aching from everything that had happened. The bond pulsed again. Wrong. Not settling. Not right. Her breathing picked up slightly as she pulled against the restraints, not hard, just enough to feel them. And that was when something shifted. A pressure. From inside. Her fingers curled, the chains creaked. Sera froze. She hadn't pulled that hard. A low sound escaped her throat, unfamiliar, and the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. Something was there, not outside, inside, watching, waiting. Her grip tightened again. This time, the chain snapped. The sound echoed through the cell, sharp and impossible. And Sera stared at the broken metal around her wrist before slowly testing the other one. It broke easier, like it had never been meant to hold her. Her breathing slowed. Not from calm, from realization. She stood carefully, her body adjusting faster than it should have, her senses sharper now as she moved toward the door. It wasn't locked. That didn't matter. She opened it anyway. The hallway beyond was empty. Too empty. But she didn't question it. Didn't stop. She moved. By the time anyone noticed, she was gone. No struggle, no noise, just broken chains on the floor. Far beyond the walls, Sera finally stopped, the forest stretching around her in a way that felt different now, clearer, sharper, alive in a way she had never noticed before. She could hear everything, feel everything. Her own heartbeat sounded louder, stronger. She looked down at her hands slowly, flexing her fingers as something unfamiliar moved beneath her skin, not painful, not violent, just there. Real. Sera lifted her head toward the moon, the same one that had watched her fall, and this time, when her eyes caught the light. They didn't stay human. Silver returned, clear, unhidden, and for the first time in her life, Sera didn't feel empty. Back at the palace, Carl stood still, and the bond flickering faintly in his chest, unstable, distant, but still there. And when the guard dropped to one knee and said, "My king, she's gone," he didn't react, because he already knew. He could feel it. Not weakness, not fear. Something else. Something that didn't fit. Carl stepped forward into the night, his gaze fixed ahead as the realization settled fully into place. This was no longer about control, or punishment, or dominance. This was something else entirely. Because the weakest girl in the kingdom was gone. And whatever had taken her place had just begun. Carl didn't wait for dawn, and by the time the first light began to stretch across the horizon, pale and uncertain, he was already far beyond the palace walls, moving through the forest alone with a pace that did not slow and a focus that did not break. No guards followed him, no trackers. He didn't need them. The bond was there, faint, unstable, flickering like something struggling to exist properly, and yet it was enough to guide him, even if not in the way it should have. It didn't lead him cleanly. It pulsed, pulled, then vanished, only to pull again moments later, sharper and more insistent, as if whatever connected him to her refused to settle into something predictable. Wrong. Everything about it was wrong, and that was exactly why he kept moving. Because this was no longer a hunt driven by anger or punishment, nor was it about reclaiming control over something that had slipped through his grasp. This was something else now. A hunt for answers. Deep within the forest, Sera moved without direction, her steps uneven at first, but gradually finding rhythm as the world around her shifted into something sharper, clearer, and far more intense than anything she had ever known. Branches brushed against her arms, cold and rough, but she barely felt them. The air filled her lungs too easily, too deeply. Every sound reached her, leaves shifting under unseen movement, distant animals stepping cautiously through the undergrowth, the wind dragging itself across bark and root. And it was too much. Far too much, flooding her senses until she could no longer tell what to focus on. She stopped suddenly. Hard. Her hands pressed against her ears as if that could block it out. "Stop," she whispered, her voice strained and thin against the overwhelming noise. But nothing stopped. Nothing faded. If anything, it only grew clearer. Her heartbeat rose above everything else, louder now, stronger, pounding against her chest in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, like it belonged to something larger than her, something that had always been there but had never been allowed to surface. A surge hit her without warning, hot, fast, violent in the way it rushed through her body. She gasped, stumbling forward as her hand caught against the rough bark of a nearby tree, gripping it tightly as if it were the only thing anchoring her in place. "What is happening to me?" The question slipped out in a breath, but no answer came. Only that presence, closer now, not speaking, not forming words, but there, watching, waiting. Sera pushed herself away from the tree almost immediately, her instincts rejecting stillness, because standing in one place felt worse than moving, as if stopping would allow whatever was building inside her to catch up completely. So she kept going. Carl slowed. Not because he wanted to, but because the pull hit him again, sharper this time, stronger and closer, forcing his body to adjust as his head turned slightly, recalibrating his direction without hesitation. His eyes scanned the forest. Quiet. Too quiet. Even the animals had cleared out. That alone told him enough. She had passed through here, and whatever was happening to her, it wasn't contained. Carl stepped forward again, his movements controlled, precise, every step measured as his focus narrowed further. But beneath that control, something else had begun to rise. Not uncertainty, not fear, instinct, alert, cautious, because whatever he was tracking now didn't feel like prey. It felt unknown. Sera stumbled into a clearing without realizing how far she had come, her body reacting faster than her thoughts, her breathing uneven now as her chest rose and fell in a rhythm she couldn't control. She stopped in the center of it. Her hands lifted slowly. She stared at them. They trembled, then tightened. and the air around her shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. She felt it. That same surge again, but stronger now, pressing outward as if her body could no longer contain it properly, her chest rising sharply as she tried to steady herself. "Stop," she said again, louder this time, a desperation creeping into her voice. Still nothing, only that presence, closer, pressing harder, and then, a sound, a step, behind her. Sera froze, slowly. She turned. Carl stood at the edge of the clearing, unmoving, his figure framed by shadow and light, as his gaze locked onto her with a focus that felt heavier than anything she had faced before. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them stretched, thick with something neither of them could name. "You run poorly," Carl said at last, his voice calm, measured, carrying none of the urgency that should have been there. But his eyes told a different story. Sharper, more aware. Sera took a step back instinctively, her body reacting before her thoughts could form. "I didn't ask to be chased. You didn't have to run." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't choose this." "Neither did I." Silence followed. Heavy, uncomfortable. Sera's fingers curled slightly at her sides, and that feeling, whatever it was, began building again, faster now, responding to her emotions in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Carl noticed immediately. Of course he did. His gaze dropped briefly to her hands before lifting back to her face. "Stop fighting it," he said. "I don't even know what it is," she snapped, the frustration breaking through clearly now. And that was the truth. The worst part of it. Because whatever was happening to her, it wasn't something she understood, and it wasn't something she felt capable of controlling. It felt like something waking up. Carl took a step forward. Just one. Slow. Deliberate. Sera reacted instantly. She turned and ran. Instinct took over completely. Branches snapped beneath her feet as she pushed forward, her body moving faster than it ever had before. But this time, Carl didn't wait. He moved. Faster. Much faster. Within seconds, he closed the distance, his presence right behind her, close enough for the bond to react again, spiking sharply between them as Sera felt it clash inside her chest. That resistance, that rejection. It made her stumble. Carl reached for her. And that was when everything broke. The surge exploded. Not like before. Stronger, sharper, uncontrolled, it tore through her from the inside, not physical, not visible, but powerful enough to stop her body completely, as the air around her reacted violently, leaves lifting from the ground, branches trembling as if something unseen had pushed through the space all at once. Carl stopped too. Not by choice. Something in his instincts forced him to. Sera stood with her back to him, her breathing slowing unnaturally as it deepened, then shifted into something steadier. Something different. "Get away from me," she said. But her voice wasn't stable. It wasn't entirely hers. Carl didn't move. He couldn't. Because what he was feeling was wrong. Not dominance. Not submission. Something else entirely. Something that didn't belong to any rank he understood. Sera turned slowly, and when her eyes met his, they weren't human. Not flickering. Not fading. Silver. Clear. Alive. Carl felt it then. Not fear, never fear, but recognition of power, raw, untrained, but undeniable. "What are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of command and filled instead with something closer to truth. Sera shook her head slightly. "I don't know." And for the first time, he believed her. The air pulsed again. Stronger. Carl's instincts reacted immediately. Not to attack, not to dominate, but to hesitate. It was brief, almost invisible, but it was there. The Alpha King hesitated. because what stood before him was not prey, not weak, not broken, and certainly not normal. Sera stepped back slowly, the silver in her eyes flickering now, unstable but still present as her breathing picked up again, and the energy dropped just as suddenly as it had risen. Gone, as if it had never been there. Her eyes returned to normal. Her body swayed slightly. Weak again. Confused again. Human again. The contrast was sharp, and too sharp. Carl stepped forward once more, but this time his movements were different. More careful, more measured, no longer driven by pursuit but by something else he had not yet defined. "You're coming back," he said. Sera let out a quiet, bitter breath. "Like I have a choice." Carl didn't answer, because that wasn't entirely true anymore, and he knew it. As they stood there, the forest shifted. Not around them, but beyond, distant. Faint, but real. Carl's gaze moved past her briefly, scanning the trees, his jaw tightening just slightly as he registered it without reacting fully. Because whatever Sera was becoming, it wasn't hidden. Not anymore. And they would not be the only ones to feel it. Carl looked back at her. Longer this time, more carefully. Because this wasn't weakness. This wasn't a mistake. And it wasn't something he could ignore. This was something new. Something dangerous. Something that had the potential to change everything. And for the first time, he wasn't looking at Sera like a burden, or a possession, or even a problem. He was looking at her like a question, one he hadn't answered yet. Because Sera was not prey. She was not normal. And whatever she was becoming had only just begun. Carl didn't bind her when they returned, and that was the first thing everyone noticed as the palace gates opened and the two of them stepped inside. Not as alpha and prisoner, but something far less defined and far more unsettling. There were no chains, no restraints, only guards, many of them. Sera walked beside him without speaking, her gaze fixed ahead, her shoulders steady despite the weight of every eye that followed her. Yet the space between her and Carl felt anything but neutral, tightening with every step as something unseen pulled and pushed at the same time. The bond. It wasn't calm, it wasn't steady. It burned. She felt it constantly, sharp and restless, pressing against her chest like it was trying to settle into place and failing. And the worst part was knowing he could feel it too. They stepped into the main hall, and the reaction was immediate. Eyes turned, voices lowered, whispers spread faster than footsteps. "That's her. She escaped. She's back?" Sera didn't react, didn't slow, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing anything in her expression, because she had already learned what attention like that meant. And she refused to feed it. Carl stopped. The room followed. "She stays." The words were simple. Final. A guard hesitated, just enough for it to be noticed. "My king, where should we—" "Close." That was all he said. Close. Not the cells, not the lower chambers, close to him. The silence that followed carried more reaction than any protest could have, confusion and discomfort moving quietly through the room. But no one questioned him again. They wouldn't. Sera's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not staying here," she said, her voice low but firm. Carl didn't look at her. "You are." "I'm not your prisoner." "You're not." That made her pause, just for a second. "Then what am I?" Carl glanced at her then briefly, measuring in a way that made the question feel heavier than it should have. "I haven't decided." That landed harder than chains ever could. Sera looked away first, not because she had nothing to say, but because she didn't like how that answer felt. Undefined, uncertain, and somehow worse. They placed her in a chamber not far from Carl's, not locked, but far from free, the presence of guards making the boundary clear even without restraints. Always watched, always monitored. But something was off. Sera noticed it quickly. The guards didn't stand too close. They avoided her gaze, spoke only when necessary. At first, she thought it was because of him, because of Carl. Then she realized it wasn't. It was her. One guard lingered near the door, shifting his weight more often than needed, his unease quiet but visible if you knew where to look. Sera sat near the window, arms folded loosely as she studied him for a moment. "Why are you nervous?" she asked. The guard stiffened immediately. "I'm not." "You are." Silence followed. He didn't argue again, didn't deny it. Sera looked away after a moment, not because she lost interest, but because she felt it too. That pressure, subtle, constant, like something beneath the surface was waiting. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the bond flared again. Not gentle, not quiet, but sharp and restless, like it was trying to force something into place and failing each time it tried. Sera sat up slowly, exhaling under her breath. Stop. But it didn't. If anything, it pushed harder. Her fingers pressed lightly into the bed beneath her, and the wood creaked in response. A small sound, but enough to make her freeze. She hadn't meant to press that hard. Slowly, she released it. The pressure eased, but not completely. It never did. Across the hall, Carl stood by the window, still and silent as he watched the darkness outside, though his attention wasn't truly there. It was on the bond, unstable, unpredictable, alive in a way it shouldn't be. It didn't respond to him the way bonds were meant to, didn't settle under his control, didn't align with instinct. Instead, it resisted, pushing back whenever he tried to read it clearly, and when she felt something, it reacted. Carl's gaze shifted slightly. He didn't need to see her. He knew something had changed again, so he stepped away from the window. Quiet. Thinking. The next morning, Sera was brought to the training grounds, not with purpose, not with instruction, but with intent. To be seen. Carl stood at the edge, arms behind his back, his posture relaxed, but his attention sharp as he watched everything without appearing to. Sera stayed where they placed her, still, unmoving. But the reaction around her spoke louder than anything she could have done. The wolves kept their distance. Not ordered, not instructed, they simply moved away. Even the stronger ones, Carl noticed. Of course he did. His eyes tracked every shift, every hesitation, every subtle change in behavior that broke pattern. Sera noticed too. "They're afraid," she said quietly. "They're cautious," Carl replied. "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It's not." Silence followed. Then, a misstep. One of the wolves moved too close, not intentionally, just a moment of poor positioning during movement. But it was enough. Sera didn't think. Her body reacted first. A pulse moved through her, sharp, invisible but real. The wolf stopped instantly, head lowered, not by choice, not by thought, by instinct, submission. The entire ground shifted. Everyone felt it. Carl didn't move, but his eyes sharpened, because that was not normal. Sera stepped back slightly, her breathing uneven now. "I didn't do that," she said. Carl didn't answer, because he had seen it clearly. She had. Later, as she walked back through the halls, and the air felt heavier again, not threatening, not hostile, but aware in a way that made her slow slightly. Something wasn't right. She turned. No one there. No footsteps. No sound. But still, something was watching. Not like the guards. Not like the others. Different. Intentional. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but after a moment she kept moving. because stopping might mean finding it, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. Carl stood in a separate chamber later that day, no longer alone as one of the elders faced him, older, quieter, carrying a presence shaped by years rather than power. "Say it," Carl said. The elder hesitated. "That girl, Sera." The elder nodded once. "Sera, she's not right. I'm aware." "No," the elder replied carefully, his tone shifting. "You don't understand." Carl's expression didn't change. "Then explain." The elder exhaled slowly. "I've seen something like this before." That caught Carl's attention. Slightly. "Where?" "A long time ago," the elder said, his voice quieter now. "Before your rule. Before this pack became what it is." Carl's gaze hardened. "And?" But the elder didn't answer. Because he wasn't looking at Carl anymore. He was looking past him, at the doorway. Sera stood there. Still. Silent. She hadn't meant to come that far, but something had drawn her, that same subtle pull she couldn't explain, and now she stood in the middle of it without meaning to. The elder's face changed instantly. No hesitation. No control. His eyes widened slightly, then dropped to her neck, to the mark, before lifting again to her eyes. And something in him broke. Recognition. Fear. Real fear. He took a small step back. Barely noticeable. But Carl saw it. Sera saw it too. "What?" she asked quietly. The elder didn't respond. Couldn't. Because whatever he was seeing, whatever he remembered, it wasn't just unusual. It was wrong. Dangerously wrong. Carl shifted slightly, placing himself just enough between them, not protective, not yet, but aware. "Speak," he said. The elder swallowed, his voice unsteady now. "That's not a broken bond." Silence filled the room. Heavy. Tight. Then, "That's a sealed one." Sera's breath caught, Carl's eyes darkened, and the elder's face lost all color. Because seals like that were never placed on something weak. They were placed on something that should never have been allowed to exist. The council chamber was hidden for a reason, buried deep within the palace with no guards at its doors and no markings along the corridors to guide the uninvited, so that only those summoned could find it. And even then, only if they already knew where to look. Carl stood at the center of the room, silent and still as the elders gathered around him, their presence heavy with age, knowledge, and something far less certain than they were used to carrying. No one spoke at first, because what had already been said refused to settle. A sealed bond. It didn't make sense. It wasn't supposed to exist. "Explain it," Carl said at last, his voice calm but leaving no room for delay. The same elder stepped forward, slower now, more careful with each movement, as if the words he carried had weight. "There are records," he began, "but most were destroyed, buried, forgotten on purpose." Carl didn't interrupt. "Not wolves," the elder continued, "not rogues either, something before both." A brief pause followed. Something stronger. The room didn't move, but the tension shifted, tightening in a way that made the silence heavier. Carl's gaze hardened slightly. "Stronger than alphas?" The elder hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The silence that followed was short, but it carried weight. "Then why erase them?" Carl asked. Another elder spoke this time, his voice quieter but no less firm. "Because they didn't follow the hierarchy." Carl's eyes shifted to him. "They didn't submit," the elder continued. "Not to alphas, not to bonds, not even to the moon in the way we do." "That's not possible," someone muttered under their breath. "It was," the first elder said quietly. "And that was the problem." Carl remained still, but now he was listening closely. "They could break authority," the elder went on, his tone lowering further. "Override bonds, Turn power against itself. A pause. Control it. That word settled heavily in the room. Carl's jaw tightened just slightly. And you're saying she's one of them? No, the elder replied quickly. That bloodline was wiped out. Then what is she? Silence answered him. No one spoke, because no one knew. And uncertainty was far more dangerous than any clear answer. Carl exhaled slowly, then stepped back, his expression returning to something controlled, something final. This changes nothing. The room stilled immediately. She remains under my control. But, one elder began. Carl's gaze cut toward him. Sharp, final. There is no but. No one spoke again. Because whatever Sera might be, Carl was still Alpha King, and his authority remained untouched. At least, for now. Sera wasn't meant to hear any of it. But that same pull, the one she didn't understand, the one that kept guiding her without explanation, brought her there again, quietly, carefully, until she stood just outside the chamber. Not inside, but close enough. Close enough to hear. Fragments slipped through the stone. Older. Stronger. Break bonds. Her breathing slowed, not from calm, but from focus, her hand pressing lightly against the cold wall as she listened, her chest tightening with each word she didn't fully understand but somehow felt. They didn't submit. That one stayed. It echoed. Over and over. Didn't submit. Something inside her reacted instantly. Sharp, immediate. Her fingers curled slightly. The air around her shifted. Subtle, but real. Control it. That word hit differently, because she didn't feel in control. Not of her body. Not of the bond. Not of whatever was waking up inside her. Her breathing deepened, uneven now as something pressed outward from within. Something that felt less like growth, and more like something being forced awake. I'm not, she whispered. But the words didn't finish, because the pressure rose again. Stronger this time. Her back straightened slightly, not by choice, but because something inside her pushed forward, aware now, listening, reacting. And then came the anger. Quiet at first, then sharper, not just at them, at everything, at the way they spoke about her, decided what she was, without knowing. Her hand pressed harder into the wall, the stone cracked, a small sound, but enough. Inside the chamber, everything stopped. Carl turned his head instantly. He had heard it. Of course he had. He moved before anyone else could react, crossing the room in a few steps as the door opened. And Sera stood there. Still, but not the same. Her eyes met his. And for a brief moment, silver flickered. Not fully, but enough. Carl stepped toward her slowly, measured. You shouldn't be here. Sera didn't move. Neither should whatever this is, she replied quietly. The elders shifted behind him, uneasy now, their attention fixed entirely on her. Sera didn't look at them. Only him. What did you do to me? I didn't do this, Carl said. That bond says otherwise. His expression didn't change, but the bond between them spiked, hard. Both of them felt it. Clashing, rejecting, alive. Sera flinched slightly, her breath catching before she steadied herself again. I can feel it, she said. It's wrong. Carl studied her for a moment longer, then spoke, quieter now. It's not just the bond. Her chest rose slowly. Then what is it? He didn't answer immediately, because now he was starting to see it. The way the air responded to her. The way others reacted without understanding why. The way the bond refused to settle. The pieces were connecting, and he didn't like where they led. You're changing, he said. Sera let out a soft, bitter breath. I don't even know what I was to begin with. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It felt charged, unstable. The elders didn't step forward, didn't interrupt, because something about the space between Carl and Sera now felt dangerous and growing. That night, the palace was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful but aware, as if something had shifted beneath everything, and no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. But not everyone stayed still. Far from the main halls, deep within a forgotten corridor, a figure moved carefully through the dark, their steps light, their presence deliberate as they stopped before a small stone table. A strip of parchment was pulled free. Only a few words were written. Nothing more. No explanation. No detail. "She's alive." The ink dried. The message was rolled, sealed, and passed into waiting hands without hesitation. No name. No trace. Because whoever sent it understood exactly what it meant. Far beyond the kingdom, something stirred. Not awake. Not fully. But aware enough. Because those words were not just information. They were a signal. And whatever had been waiting had just been called. Back in her chamber, Sera stood by the window, the moonlight resting softly against her skin as she looked down at her hands again, turning them slightly as if expecting to see something different. They looked the same, but they didn't feel the same. Nothing did. Her fingers curled slowly. That energy flickered again. Quieter now, but still there. Still real. Her gaze lifted slightly, and for a moment, Silver returned. Not forced, not sudden, just present. Sera didn't look away, because this time, she wasn't afraid. What she felt instead was something sharper, something deeper, understanding, incomplete, but growing. Because whatever she was becoming was no longer hidden, and whatever had once been erased was no longer gone. Somewhere in the distance, the message continued its path, and the world began to respond. By the next day, the tension inside the palace had shifted into something heavier, something no one spoke about, but everyone felt the moment they stepped into the halls. It lingered. In the silence. In the distance people kept. In the way eyes followed without meaning to. Sera walked through the corridor with 2 guards behind her, not close enough to touch, not far enough to ignore, their presence constant in a way that made it impossible to forget. Watching. She stopped abruptly. "Stop following me." Neither of them moved. "Those are the king's orders," one replied. Sera let out a quiet breath, her jaw tightening slightly as she looked ahead again. Of course. Everything came back to him. "Then tell your king I'm not something to be watched." No response came, because there was nothing they could say. So she turned and kept walking, faster this time, as the pressure in her chest, small when she woke, began rising again, building with every whisper, every glance, every step that followed too closely behind her. It was getting louder, harder to ignore. Carl stood in the training grounds, exactly where he had been the day before, still and observant, his attention fixed on everything without appearing to focus on anything. He hadn't called her there, but he knew she would come. And she did. Sera stepped into the open space, her gaze finding his almost immediately. No hesitation this time, no uncertainty in the way she walked toward him. "Call them off," she said. Carl didn't move. "They're not harming you. That's not the point." Silence stretched briefly between them. "Then what is?" Sera closed the distance faster than before, her steps sharper now, more certain. "They're watching me like I'm about to break." Carl's gaze didn't shift. "Are you?" The question landed harder than it should have. Sera's chest tightened. "Maybe I wouldn't be," she said, her voice sharpening, "if you stopped treating me like something you don't understand." "I don't understand you," Carl replied simply. The truth of it didn't calm anything. If anything, It made it worse, because she felt it too. That pressure. Rising again. Faster now, stronger. Her hands curled at her sides. "You think I don't know that?" she said. "You think I don't feel it too?" Carl stepped forward this time, closing the space between them. Not aggressive, but no longer distant either. "You're not stable." The words hit, sharp. Sera let out a short, bitter laugh. "I wasn't stable before you marked me." The bond reacted instantly. A sharp pull, then a violent clash. Sera's breath hitched. Carl felt it too, but neither of them stepped back. "You think this is because of me?" he asked. "I think everything changed because of you." And that was enough. It didn't build this time. It broke. A surge of energy tore outward from Sera, fast and violent, pushing through the space around her with a force that didn't follow rules, didn't slow, didn't ask permission. The air shifted hard. Dust lifted from the ground. The guards behind her dropped instantly, their knees hitting the earth before they understood why, their heads lowering in forced submission that came without thought. Around the training ground, the wolves reacted the same way, one by one, no command, no resistance. They bowed. Carl didn't move, but he felt it. That pressure. Different from alpha dominance, stronger in a way that didn't belong to anything he had ever known. His instincts responded, not to control it, not to overpower it, but to recognize it. Sera stood at the center of it, her breathing uneven, her chest rising and falling as her eyes glowed silver again, not flickering this time, not fading. Clear. Alive. "What is this?" she whispered. But her voice wasn't the same. It carried something deeper now. Something layered. The ground beneath her feet cracked slightly. Not from impact, but from pressure. As if the force around her was too much for it to hold. Carl watched everything, every shift, every reaction, because there was no doubt left now, no room for denial. She wasn't broken. She wasn't weak. She wasn't normal. She was dangerous. In a way he had never been trained for. The energy pulsed once more, then slowly began to fall, the pressure easing just enough for the air to settle again, though no one moved. The guards stayed down. The wolves didn't rise. Not yet. Sera's breathing slowed. The silver in her eyes flickered, then disappeared. Her body swayed slightly, like whatever strength had surged through her had been pulled away all at once. Carl moved, fast. He closed the distance before she could fall, his hand catching her arm, steadying her before she lost balance. Sera froze at the contact. She didn't pull away, didn't lean in. She just stood there, still. The bond flared again, but this time it was different. Less violent, still unstable, but quieter. Carl looked down at her, and closer than before, his gaze no longer measuring or dismissing, but searching, seeing her as something real now. Not a problem, not a mistake. Something that needed to be understood. Something that needed to be protected. The thought came uninvited, and he didn't like it. But he didn't ignore it either. Sera lifted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his again, tired now but still searching. "Tell me what I am." For a moment, Carl almost answered. Almost, but instead, "You're not ready for that." Sera pulled her arm free, not harsh, but deliberate. "I don't get to be ready," she said quietly. "It's already happening." Carl didn't stop her, because he knew. She was right. The training ground remained silent long after she left. The guards slowly rising. The wolves regaining themselves, all of them shaken in ways they didn't fully understand. This time, they watched Carl, waiting. For an order. For an explanation. For anything. He gave them nothing. He simply turned and walked away. Because there was nothing he could say. Not yet. Later, in his chamber, Carl stood alone, unmoving as he replayed it all. The way they had dropped, the way the air had shifted, the way even his own instincts had paused. Not in fear, but in recognition. That kind of power didn't belong inside a pack. It didn't follow rules, it changed them. He exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the window, toward the distance beyond the palace walls. Because something else had changed too. Not inside. Outside. Far beyond. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. Faint. Distant. Moving. Far from the kingdom, beyond forests and borders, a group stood in silence, the message already in their hands, already understood without question. She's alive. That was all they needed. A figure stepped forward, calm and certain. Then we move. No hesitation followed. No doubt. Because this wasn't opportunity. It was necessity. Back in the palace, Sera stood alone once more. But it didn't feel the same. Her hands rested at her sides, steady now. Controlled in a way they hadn't been before, though the energy beneath her skin remained, quieter but still present. Still real. Still waiting. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, her focus sharper now. Because whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. And deep down, she knew something else. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Like beyond the kingdom walls, they were already on their way. And this time, they weren't coming to watch. They were coming for her. They arrived at dawn. No warning, no chaos, just presence. The guards on the outer wall felt it first, an unnatural stillness pressing into the air, like the world itself had paused. By the time the horns sounded, it was already too late to pretend this was ordinary. They stood beyond the gates. A small group. Too small. That was the first problem. Carl stepped onto the high terrace, his gaze fixed on them, unmoving, unreadable, while below him the tension spread quietly through every guard who dared to look. They didn't look like a pack. No banners, no markings, but they carried certainty. One of them stepped forward, calm. "We're not here to fight." His voice carried easily across the distance. Carl didn't respond. Not yet. That shifted something. "State your purpose," Carl said. The man didn't hesitate. "We want the girl." Silence fell across the wall. Carl's gaze sharpened slightly. "Be specific." "Sera." Her name sounded wrong in his mouth, like it belonged to something beyond this place. Carl stepped forward. "And why would I give you anything that belongs to me?" A pause. Then, "She doesn't belong to you." The air tightened. "Everything in this kingdom does," Carl replied. "That's where you're wrong." No challenge, no fear, just certainty. "You don't understand what she is." Carl's eyes darkened. "And you do?" A small shift. "Yes." That answer didn't sit well. "Then explain." The man shook his head. "Not here." A pause. "Send her out. We take her. No one else gets hurt." A ripple moved through the guards. Carl didn't react. Because this wasn't a request. It was a test. "You came to my gates," he said slowly, "and expect me to hand her over?" "You call it protection," the man replied. "We call it delay." Silence stretched. Then, "She's already been found, whether by us or something worse." That landed. Carl caught it immediately. "Something worse." "What are you implying?" "That we're not the only ones who felt her wake up." The words settled heavy. They knew. Exactly. Carl made his decision. No. Simple. Final. She stays. The man didn't argue. Didn't react. But something in him shifted. "Then you've chosen the harder outcome." Carl's voice dropped. "Leave. No threats. No attack. Just a quiet turn." They walked away. Too easily. That was the second problem. Inside the palace, tension spread fast. Whispers sharpened. They should have taken her. She'll bring war. She already has. Others resisted. She's under the Alpha's protection. Does that still mean anything? Sera heard everything, especially when they tried to whisper. She stood near the window, arms folded, still, but not calm. They didn't come to threaten, she said quietly. Carl stood across from her, watching. No. They came because they know. He didn't deny it. Sera met his gaze. They know what I am. They think they do. That's enough. Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened. Carl stepped closer. You're under my protection. Sera exhaled softly. That's not protection. What is it? She held his gaze. A reason. That landed. Carl didn't respond, because he understood. She wasn't just a risk. She was a target. And they're not the only ones coming, she said. No. Her fingers curled slightly, but she held it down, forced it still. Then why keep me here? Because if I let you go, I lose control. Sera gave a faint, humorless smile. You never had control. They both knew that was true. That night the palace didn't rest. Guards doubled, watches tightened, and still, it felt wrong. Sera stood in her chamber, the silence pressing in, heavy, aware. Watched. Again. She moved toward the door and opened it. The guard straightened. My lady, who's been here? No one. She studied him. Then the empty hall. Too still. She stepped back inside, closed the door, and waited. Her breathing slowed, her senses stretched, listening. Then, a shift. Behind her. She turned. Too late. Steel flashed. She moved just enough to avoid the first strike. The second came faster, closer. Sera raised her arm. The blade never touched her. The air pushed back. Hard. The attacker staggered, not expecting resistance. Sera's eyes flickered silver. Who sent you? She demanded. No answer, only movement, another attack. This time, she felt it rising, that surge, stronger, angrier. The room shifted, the walls creaked, the attacker faltered, just for a second. The door burst open. Carl moved, fast. One strike, clean, final. The body dropped. Silence followed, heavy. Sera stood still, breathing uneven. Carl looked at her, then the body, then back at her. Inside the palace. Not a question, a realization. Sera swallowed. They're not waiting anymore. Carl's jaw tightened, because this wasn't outside. Not anymore. It was inside, closer, watching, waiting, and now, acting. Somewhere in the palace, hidden in shadow, someone else listened, still, patient. A faint smile touched their lips. The first attempt had failed, but it wouldn't be the last. Now it wasn't just about who wanted Sera. It was about who would reach her first. The attack inside the palace passed one thing. A message. And it was clear. Nowhere inside the palace was safe. As Carl stood over the fallen attacker for only a moment longer before turning away, his thoughts already moving ahead of the room, because this wasn't just a breach. By nightfall, he had made the decision. Not announced, not debated, just made. You're leaving, he told Sera, his voice low, controlled, as if saying it any louder would give the walls permission to listen. Sera leaned slightly against the stone behind her, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharper than before. Running? She asked. Carl didn't react to the tone. Relocating. A brief pause. Somewhere they won't reach you first. Sera let out a quiet breath, something almost like a laugh but without humor. They already reached me. Carl's gaze didn't shift. Not like this. They left in silence. No guards, no announcement. Just the sound of the gates opening briefly into the night before closing behind them again. as if the palace itself was trying to forget they had ever been there. The forest swallowed them quickly. Dark, cold, alive in a way the palace never was. For a while, neither of them spoke. Sera walked slightly ahead, her steps steadier now, her body no longer moving like it didn't belong to her, though the air around her still carried that faint, unnatural pressure. Carl followed close enough to react, not close enough to touch. Because the bond, it still burned. "You don't trust them anymore," Sera said finally, her voice cutting softly through the quiet as branches shifted underfoot. "I trust what I can control," Carl replied. "And this?" she asked, slowing slightly. "Can you control this?" The bond reacted instantly, a sharp pull, then resistance. Carl didn't answer, because he couldn't. They reached deeper into the forest before stopping. A clearing, hidden, quiet enough to breathe. Carl scanned the area once, then settled. "This will hold for now." Sera turned to face him fully. "For now," she repeated. The words felt heavier than they should, because both of them knew. Nothing about this was temporary anymore. The silence stretched, not empty, just waiting. Sera stepped back slightly, creating space, her arms folding loosely as if she were trying to hold herself together without realizing it. "Start talking," she said. Carl's gaze lifted to hers. "You already heard enough." "Fragments," she replied. "Not truth. A beat. Tell me what I am." The bond pulsed again, slower this time, deeper. Carl exhaled, long and controlled, before finally stepping into it. "There were things before wolves," he said, his voice steady but quieter now, like the forest itself was listening. "Before alphas. Before the system that holds the packs together." Sera didn't interrupt, didn't move, but something in her sharpened. "They weren't part of the hierarchy," he continued. "They didn't answer to it." A pause. "They controlled it." Sera's brow tightened slightly. "What does that even mean?" Carl's gaze didn't waver. "It means the bond doesn't define them." Another step closer. "They define the bond." The air shifted. Subtle, but real. Sera felt it immediately. That pressure inside her responding, not resisting this time, not fighting, but listening, awake. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice lacked certainty. Carl didn't hesitate. "It is. A beat. And it's you." The words landed, harder than anything before. Sera shook her head once, a quiet denial forming too late. "No, I don't have a wolf." Carl's expression didn't change. "You were never missing one." Silence. Heavy. "You were sealed." Everything stilled, even the wind. Sera's breath caught slightly, her chest tightening as something inside her reacted faster than her thoughts could catch up. "Sealed?" she echoed. Carl nodded once. A suppression placed deliberately. "For what?" she asked, her voice sharpening now. Carl held her gaze. "To stop you." That broke something, not visibly, but deeply. A pulse burst outward from her, sharp and sudden, lifting leaves from the ground and pushing the air back in a quiet wave that neither of them could ignore. Her eyes flickered. Silver. Stronger this time. More stable. "I'm not something that needs to be stopped," she said, but her voice carried weight now, layered, unfamiliar even to her. Carl didn't step back, because now he understood. "You're tied to it," he said. "All of it." Sera's breathing slowed. "To what?" Carl's voice dropped. "The origin of alpha authority." A pause. "The bond itself." Another. "And the moon." The words settled like something ancient, unmovable. Sera's fingers curled slightly, her gaze dropping for a moment before lifting again, sharper now, clearer. I can feel it, she whispered. Carl stepped closer. What do you feel? Her eyes met his, and this time, there was no confusion in them. The bond, she said. A pause. It's not pulling me. Her voice lowered. I'm holding it. Carl felt it. That shift, that reversal. Because for the first time, his instincts didn't push forward. They paused, not in fear, in recognition. Sera stepped back again, distance forming between them, not just physically but emotionally, as the truth settled in deeper than anything else had. So all this time, she said slowly, I wasn't weak. Carl didn't answer, because she already knew. I was contained, she finished. The air around her pulsed again, quieter, controlled, but stronger. You need control, Carl said, his tone shifting now, less command, more warning. If you don't learn it, this will break everything. Sera's expression hardened slightly. Everything is already breaking. And she wasn't wrong. The bond flickered again. Different now, less chaotic, more aware. Carl watched her closely, something in his gaze softening just enough to notice, even if he didn't acknowledge it. Because she wasn't what he thought she was. Not weak. Not broken. Not something to control. Something to protect. Then, Sera's head lifted suddenly, her focus shifting past him, into the trees. Carl noticed instantly. What is it? Sera didn't look at him. They found us. The forest answered. Not slowly, not quietly. Branches snapped, footsteps moved, fast, closing in. Carl stepped forward without thinking, placing himself between her and the approaching sound, his posture shifting into something colder, sharper, ready. Stay behind me. Sera didn't move, didn't obey. Her voice came steady. They're not here for you. A pause. They're here for me. The first figure broke through the trees. Then another. Then more. No hesitation. No warning. Carl's jaw tightened as his stance locked into place. Because there was no mistaking it now. No delay. No negotiation. This wasn't pursuit. This wasn't a test. This was war. The forest didn't wait. It broke. Steel met bone. Shadows burst from between the trees. The quiet that had held for seconds shattered into violence as the first wave collided with Carl's line of defense. There were no warnings this time. No words. Only war. Carl moved first. Fast. Precise. His body shifted into dominance without hesitation, his presence crashing outward as he met the attackers head-on, his strikes clean, controlled, lethal in a way that had made entire packs fear his name. They didn't fall back. That was the first problem. They held, pressed forward, like they had expected him. Sera stood behind him at first. Still, watching. But her chest was tightening again. That pressure building. Not from fear, not from panic, but from something deeper. Something that had been waiting far longer than this moment. They weren't here for the pack. They were here for her. And they weren't afraid. Stay back, Carl ordered, his voice cutting sharply through the chaos as he drove one attacker to the ground, his dominance pushing outward again. But this time, it didn't spread the same way. The wolves fighting beside him hesitated, not disobeying, just unsteady. Carl felt it instantly. Something was interfering. Another wave hit, stronger, faster. The enemy moved differently, not like a pack, not like rogues, but something coordinated, something trained for this exact moment. For her. Sera stepped forward, just one step. But the air reacted. Carl noticed. Of course he did. Sera, don't. But she didn't stop. Because something inside her had already crossed that line. An attacker lunged past Carl, aiming straight for her. Too fast, too close. Sera didn't move away. She didn't run. Her hand lifted slightly, and everything changed. The air collapsed inward, then exploded outward. A force surged from her, invisible but undeniable, slamming into everything around her as the ground cracked beneath her feet and the trees shuddered under the pressure. The attacker never reached her. He dropped, not dead, not struck. Force down. Silence hit for half a second, then spread. One by one, wolves fell to their knees, not by injury, not by command, instinct, submission. Carl felt it, not as resistance, not as dominance, something else, something older, stronger. His body reacted, not to fight it, but to recognize it. Sera stood at the center of it, breathing steady, eyes glowing silver, fully, not flickering, not unstable, alive. What? Is she? One of the attackers whispered, his voice breaking under the weight pressing down on him. No one answered, because no one could. The battlefield had changed. Completely. Carl straightened slowly, his chest rising as he felt it more clearly now, that overwhelming presence radiating from her. Not wild, not uncontrolled, but vast. Beyond rank, beyond alpha. For the first time in his life, his instincts did not place him at the top. They placed him beneath something else. Sera's gaze moved across the field, not frantic, not afraid, focused. Every movement around her slowed, every presence bending under the invisible force she now held without effort. "I told you," she said quietly, though her voice carried across the clearing with unnatural clarity. "I didn't ask for this." The attackers tried to push back. Some forced themselves to stand. Stronger ones, different ones, but even they staggered under it. Even they struggled. Carl stepped toward her, slowly, not as a king, not as a commander, but as something else, something uncertain. "Sera," he said. Her eyes shifted to him, and for a moment, the pressure changed. Not gone, but aware of him. The bond flickered, not clashing this time, not resisting, recognizing. Carl felt it, that connection twisting into something new, something that no longer placed him above her, or in control. But beside something far greater than he had ever expected, the last of the attackers began to fall back, not defeated, not destroyed, but overwhelmed. Because this was not a fight they had prepared for. Sera didn't chase them, didn't move. She just stood there as the battlefield emptied, her power still humming in the air like something ancient that had finally awakened after being buried too long. The forest slowly settled. The pressure faded. But not completely. Never completely. Carl stood a few steps away now, watching her, really seeing her. Not the girl from the courtyard, not the one he had claimed. Something else. Sera's eyes dimmed slightly, the silver fading just enough to show something human beneath it again, though her expression didn't soften. Didn't return. Because she had seen it too. Felt it. Understood it. She wasn't weak. She never had been. She was something the world had tried to erase. And now, she was standing in it. Carl exhaled slowly. Not steady. Not controlled. Just real. Because for the first time, he knew something he had never known before. He was not the strongest presence there, and he never would be again. Sera turned slightly, looking over the aftermath. The fallen, the silence that followed, her posture no longer uncertain, no longer searching. Just certain. And in that moment, she was no longer the girl he had claimed. She was something else entirely. And whatever came next would have to face her. The aftermath stared, making the forest grew quiet again with no peace. The kind that settles slowly, unevenly, leaving behind more questions than answers as the last echoes of battle faded into the distance, and the scent of it still clung to the air. The enemy had retreated. Not broken. Not defeated. Just pulled back. Like something waiting for the right moment to strike again. Carl stood among what remained, his breathing steady but heavier than before, his gaze scanning the edges of the clearing even though the fight was already over. Because it didn't feel over. Not really. Not with her standing there. Sera hadn't moved much since it ended. She stood where the battle had shifted, where the ground had cracked beneath her power, where the air had bent and every wolf, every alpha had felt something they could not fight. She looked the same, but she wasn't. Not even close. The silver in her eyes had dimmed, but it hadn't disappeared. It lingered. Quiet. Present. Carl took a step toward her, then another. Slower this time, careful. Not because he feared her, but because he understood her now, or at least, he was beginning to. Sera. Her name left his mouth differently. Not as a command. Not as a claim. Just her name. She turned slightly. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the world stilled again. The bond shifted. Not clashing or burning. Something else. Something steadier. Balanced, but not safe. Carl stopped a few steps away. Close enough to feel it. Not close enough to assume anything. For the first time, he didn't reach for control. He let the silence sit. Then, I was wrong. The words came quietly, but they carried weight. Sera didn't respond immediately. She just watched him, studying, measuring. Not the Alpha King now, but the man standing in front of her. I saw you as something weak, Carl continued, his voice steady but stripped of its usual authority. Something to control. Something to define. A pause. You're not. The wind moved lightly between them, carrying nothing, leaving everything. Sera's expression didn't soften, but something in her eyes shifted. Not warmth. Not yet. Just acknowledgement. You don't get to decide that now, she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and it didn't waver. Carl accepted it. Didn't argue. Because she was right. I know, he said. A beat. That's why I'm not deciding. That was new, and they both felt it. The bond pulsed again. Not pulling, not forcing, just there. Sera exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping for the briefest moment before lifting again. Sharper now, more grounded in something that hadn't been there before. Control. Not of him, not of the situation, of herself. I spent my whole life being told what I was, she said, her voice quieter now, but heavier. Wolfless, useless, something to ignore. Her fingers curled slightly. And now I'm supposed to believe I'm something else? Carl didn't answer right away, because this wasn't something he could fix. You don't have to believe anything, he said finally. You just have to decide. That landed differently. Sera held his gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, not empty, not uncomfortable, but full of everything that had changed and everything that still hadn't settled. Then, she stepped back. Not far. Just enough. Carl felt it instantly. That distance, that choice. It wasn't rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either. I'm not yours, she said, simple, final. The words didn't cut. They clarified. Carl nodded once. I know. And this time, he meant it. The bond shifted again. Not breaking, not tightening, just adjusting. Like it was learning something new, something neither of them fully understood yet. Sera turned slightly, her gaze moving past him, past the clearing, toward something unseen but not unfelt. Her posture no longer uncertain, no longer searching, just aware. For the first time, she said softly. I get to choose. And she did. Not him. Not the pack. Not the past. Herself. The wind moved again, colder now, carrying something distant, something that didn't belong to the forest, something that hadn't been part of the battle, but had felt it. Far beyond the kingdom, beyond the reach of packs and borders. Something stirred. Not new. Not forgotten. Ancient. It had felt her. Not her fear. Not her weakness. Her power. And it didn't come with curiosity or caution. It came with intent. To rise. To meet her. To challenge her. Back in the forest, Sera's eyes lifted slightly, the faint silver flickering once more. Not unstable, not uncontrolled, but aware in a way that felt connected to something far beyond what stood in front of her. Carl saw it, felt it, but didn't interrupt. Because whatever was coming next was no longer something he could stand in front of. Only something he could stand beside. And even that would be her choice. The forest fell silent again. But this time, it wasn't waiting. It was listening. Because something greater had just awakened, and it wasn't looking for a king. It was looking for her. Thank you for staying till this moment. Would you like to see the continuation of this story in Book 2? Kindly subscribe to the channel, like and comment. Book 2 coming soon.